Mrs. Hasegawa, I'm here to answer your newspaper ad.
Elvis Presley was a model citizen. I've compiled a list of his traits for you to practice. Number 1 is dancing.
I can't talk now, dear. I'm waiting for someone to answer my ad. That's why I'm here.
Hands on your hips. Now follow my lead.
You fool me with your kisses.
Oh, that's my one ad. I know.
Heaven knows how you lied to me. You're not the way you seem.
Why is everything so dark? I am all about coffee.
Let's move on to step 2. Elvis played guitar. Here. Hold it like this. Put your fingers here. See? Now you try.
And I make great cappuccinos and lattes with
I wish I could, Mommy, but I just hired Teddy and with tourist season ending.
Conciergerie is my life. I just love to answer phones.
This is the face of romance. She looks like she could use some loving.
Oh, we might have something.
Good. Now kiss her. I'm sure Elvis had his bad days too.
Hey, so my name is Isaac Barber. I'm the Associate Dean of Student Engagement here at Huntington University. I just wanted to take some time today to just work you through Ohana. I don't know if that may be your first time seeing that clip or not, but Lilo and Stitch is definitely one of my favorite movies. And I just want to take some time to just kind of work through what Ohana actually means. Ohana is something that pops up a lot in this movie. And if you haven't seen this movie before, I would definitely tell you you probably need to get out a little bit, spend your Friday night this week, and take a peek at this movie because it's one of those groundbreaking movies, in my opinion, because it kind of shows literally two people from two different worlds engaging with each other, solving problems, and kind of making things happen. We see this in the church in Philippi also, and so we'll basically use the phrase Ohana. In the movie, they say Ohana means family, and family means no one gets left behind. We'll use that phrase, and we'll kind of dive into kind of what that phrase actually means, what that means in the movie, what that means biblically, and how that can actually play out in the roles that we play from day to day. But first, I want to take a little bit of time just to work through some terms that we want to make sure that we become familiar with. So one term is equality. Equality basically means which everyone gets the same amount of something, despite their existing needs or assets. And so if a person's 2 feet tall or a person's 6 feet tall, you still get a 5 foot ladder. I don't know if we've all seen if we've seen that picture in which like the really short kid is trying to look over the fence, and then there's a tall kid that looks over the fence, and there's a medium-sized kid that looked over the fence. But essentially, they all get the same size box. Equity kind of looks at that same picture and says, okay, maybe the shorter kid needs more boxes so that he can see over the fence. The medium-sized kid only needs one box so he can see over the fence, and the tall kid doesn't need a box at all. Diversity is one of those things that just gets tossed around a lot, right? But essentially, it just means a range of different things. And so we look at things. We may look like situations. We walk into the room and say, "Oh man, there's a lot of diversity in this room." Or I would imagine that some of you who are looking at this presentation, the assumption is like, "Hey, there's a lot of diversity." We look at some of the needs of our campus, and we just associate the needs of our campus, and we say, "Okay, we'll need a lot more diversity." We kind of toss that word around, and a lot of times we toss that word around inappropriately because we don't actually know what that means. And when we say like, okay, we need more diversity, what does that actually mean? Especially when we toss that word around in a sense that it doesn't really make sense. It's just like, okay, how can we have more difference? How can we create more difference? And a lot of times that's not the goal that we're looking for. Cultural diversity is the quality of diverse or different cultures as opposed to the monoculture, the global monoculture, or the homogenization of cultures akin to the cultural decay. More defining terms that are important to this topic. Systematic racism is a form of racism expressed in the practice of social and political institutions. It can lead to issues of discrimination and injustice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, and education, among other issues. Systems, we got this quote, we pulled this quote from a book, one of my favorite books. Systems and structures, they define systematic racism as systems and structures, that have procedures and processes that disadvantage African Americans. And so you may be a student who may work in student government, you may be a student who works in housing, and you may see just like, okay, like some of our policies, some of our practices that we're taking part in, these are some things that they don't support our African American students. Even if you take it outside of the context of African American students, we look at the context of our greater campus. You may have student groups who feel like some of your rules and some of the procedures and some of even your programs, you look at it programmatically, they may not advantage certain student groups on your campus. And you may have student groups, or you may be a part of those student groups that are looking to speak out towards those things. This is kind of what we mean. And so even though we talk about systematic racism, this is not to make anyone feel upset, but it's essentially forcing you to look at the system, and is the system providing a prejudice based off of the programs that we provide, based off of the policies that we have, based off of the things that we're actually trying to accomplish. And minority. And we talked about that. We talk about this a lot at Huntington, but we use and define minorities on our campus as our North American minorities and our international students. And so we make it specific to North American minorities and international students because that's a large part of who our population is made up of. And so, who are you in this story? Right? We talk about Lilo and Stitch, but essentially, we want to look at four main characters. Right? We see Lilo. She's kind of the outsider in this group. She's in a completely new space. Her parents are, they never make an appearance in the movie because of tragedy. She's an adopted student, but essentially, she's in a space in Hawaii in which, like, that's where she calls home, and she's pursuing friendships, and essentially she finds a friendship in Stitch. Stitch is an alien. Stitch is legitimately, literally, as literal as it can get. He's an alien. Lilo adopts Stitch as a pet, but they just become friends. And so a lot of people at large see Stitch as her pet. They see Stitch as this project. They see Stitch as a few people call Stitch ugly, right? If that's your thing, then go for it. Call a thing ugly. But a lot of people see Stitch as just like this outsider. He's an alien. He's a person who he is coming into a foreign place. He is uncomfortable in this space. And there are a lot of points in this movie in which Lilo tries to work with Stitch to make him feel not just more comfortable, but essentially tries to make him adapt. Are you Lilo or are you Stitch in this story? And then there's Lilo's older sister. Lilo is essentially forced to be the caretaker of this entire of this entire mess, right? She has a lot of her own things going on. She essentially adopted the responsibilities of her sister and then adopted the responsibilities of Stitch, as well as she has a higher authority that she has to report to, and we call him the government. But we also look at this, right? And I'll point to the church in Philippi. We can start in Acts 16, and there are also different players in this story too. And so I asked the same question: who are you in this story? We have Paul, again, the person who is responsible to carry out this message. He also responds to a higher authority. He is on a mission to spread the gospel and develop these churches, right? The first person he meets in Acts 16 is Lydia. Lydia is this business woman, right? And we see at the start of this church, Paul's interaction with Lydia is essentially the thing that starts the church. Paul's interaction with Lydia is essentially what drives up this church. After Paul's interaction with Lydia, the church is essentially established. Lydia also already has a group that Paul has begun to interact with. As he pursues, he interacts with the slave girl, right? There are a lot of adoptions that say Paul cussed this girl out. If you don't believe that adoption, that's fine. Don't send me an email about it. But Paul has this crazy interaction with this girl who essentially she was a slave. She was a slave to these people. Paul called her wicked, and eventually through their interaction, like she got saved, and she herself also began to pursue the gospel and the spreading of the gospel. And then in his last interaction, he interacts with the jailer, right? Whereas the Lydia was probably, a lot of people see it as this upperclassman citizen. The slave girl was obviously poor and a slave. The jailer was a soldier, right? He probably identified more as this middle class citizen that Paul would have engaged with. The jailer, truth be told, was ready to kill himself after an earthquake. He thought that Paul had escaped, but Paul literally saved this man's life so he could become part of this message. And so, who are we in this story, right? Essentially, we parallel two stories that are essentially built on community. We parallel two stories that are built on diversity, advocacy. They're built on education and relationships that are built on love, right? At the end of each of these stories, we see that both are welcoming community, right? The movie ends, depending on which movie you've seen, there are like 6 Lilo and Stitch movies. Depending on which movie you've seen, they all end in community, right? We look at the end of the church in Philippi in the book of Philippians. Paul greets this church in a way he doesn't greet any other church. He greets this church with love, and he greets this church with affection. And so, what place do we find ourselves in this story? Who do we see ourselves in this story? Okay, and so when we talk about Ohana meaning family, we really want to take a picture and we want to take a dive at which how are we leading the people that we're leading? Okay, so one thing I want us to take a look at, I cheated a little bit, is we want to take an assessment chart. And so definitely today, take some time to make this assessment chart. It's a 4 section assessment chart. I stole it from the StratOps group, and it basically forces you to take different pieces of your organization or your program and assess: are these things accelerating? Right? Are these things are something that we're starting off and we're getting better at? Are they peaking? Things, hey, business is booming and things can get better. Are we decelerating? Are there some things that you guys are doing that it may be losing its momentum, or are there things that like, hey, we need to automatically get better at some of these things, but we're pretty close? Or are they tanking? Are you guys leading efforts that aren't going well? You're not seeing the fruit that you want to see. Um, Take an assessment of kind of what those things are. And so as you write this down, I just want to move forward to kind of take a look at what are some things that you actually look at assessing, right? As an institution, like based off of the students that you work with or the students that you serve, how are you looking at your recruitment efforts? What are the goals, right? Does your institution, do you serve at an institution that prioritizes recruiting minority students or international students? Do you go to an institution that looks at the resources that they're putting towards recruiting those groups? What kind of retention efforts are you guys marketing to those students, and the representation of the people people who are you're recruiting? You guys have gone to your institutions far longer than I have, obviously, and so you guys understand, like, okay, like, is this something that our institution prioritizes? Is this something? Is diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, is that something that our institution says that they care about, or is it something that like you don't even hear about it until you get to the institution? Taking a look at your institution's website, and take a note, which is like, is this something that our institution cares about? Is it something that our institution advocates for? Do we advocate for diversity? Do we advocate for justice of our minority students? And we talk about retention. I work in retention, and so retention is basically your effort and practice. And so you bring students to your institution, you bring students of color towards your institution, you bring international students to your institution. What resources are available to those students? And this is a lot of where you guys participate in terms of, you guys are a lot of programmers, you guys participate in those retention efforts. A lot of you meet with those students on a regular basis. Some of you, your purview is meeting with those students. And so how is your institution resourcing you guys to make sure that you are actually engaging with those students? What kind of programs do you guys run? Do you guys run programs that, this is a one size fits all model, and so we want to make sure we can get 150 students at these programs? What the demographic of those 150 students look like, it's up to whoever decides to show up. And again, representation. If you look to your left and you look to your right, of the students who are in student leadership, do those students match the student body in your institution? Do you have a disproportionate number of one population of students when your student body is saying that, like, hey, our needs for representation is a completely different thing? And so when we talk about Ohana, we want to talk about on our campus, how do we grow Ohana, right? In the movie, it says Ohana means family, and family means no one gets left behind. But when we look deeper into Hawaiian culture and how Polynesians who essentially drove this meaning of like Ohana, kind of what Ohana means, it basically means family isn't just related to blood, it isn't just related to birthrights, and it isn't just related to the people who live on your roof. Um, Ohana means family, and family means everyone has access to survival resources. And so, what are the things that are necessary for people to survive? And do they have those resources, right? And so, when we talk about like we talk about equity and we talk about equality, when you go into your household, right, and your mom makes dinner, 99 times out of 100 times, um, a mom doesn't make dinner and say like, okay, um, Jimmy has to eat tonight and Sally, you'll eat tomorrow night. That's not how families are run. That's not how loving families are run. Everyone has access to those survival resources. And so like, hey, you may have situations. I grew up poor. I didn't grow up with the most money. And so just like, hey, we only got one pot of chili tonight. We got to divide that pot of chili up 5 ways because it was 5 of us, right? And so everyone has family means everyone has access to those survivor resources. The second thing is it's really important, and that's super key not to miss. Everyone gets to live with joy. right? And so when we talk about the programs that we run, we talk about the one-on-ones that we have, when we talk about what are some things that we actually want to move forward at our institution, every single person on your campus gets to live with joy. And so when we talk about growing Ohana, we talk about like how can we maximize on our efforts towards cultural diversity? How can we maximize on our efforts towards equity? We want to take a look at this super, super key picture that Ohana means family and family means no one gets left behind. That's the model. The model is as we pursue whether it be student satisfaction, as we pursue family, one of the things that people say when they come to recruitment visits is that insert institution here has community. Every institution has it. This is Huntington University is my fourth institution that I've worked at, and at every point, someone says like the thing that makes our university unique is community. Well, community that can be unique for your campus is that Ohana community. That means that family on our campus means that survival. Everyone has access to these survival resources, and everyone gets to live with joy. And so, Ohana means family, and family means engaging the needs of the students on your campus. And some important action steps that all of us can take, along with assessment. We take a look at that chart, and assessment is a huge, huge piece of that because assessment allows you to go back, take a peek. What are some things that we're doing well, and what are some things that we're not doing well? Increasing the programmatic effort based on engagement is one of the best places to start because you can actually take a look at your engagement and say, okay, like we're consistently having these programs. How are we making sure we're connected to the student body? What is the demographic of people who are consistently showing up to our events? Are our events diverse? Are they not diverse, but our events advertised to a diverse audience? Do we want different people to actually show up to these events, or are we having events that are specifically catered to a population of our program? Updating learning outcomes, assessing the student spaces that we have on campus. And we talk about environmental psychology. I know this isn't the class that you necessarily asked for, but environmental psychology principles kind of dictate there are certain things that we can do to our student spaces that attract a certain kind of person, right? Are our student spaces welcoming and affirming to certain kinds of people, or are our spaces welcoming everyone? Is there something for everyone to engage with this space? Or do we have systematic engagements when we talk about our programmatic efforts? Welcoming versus pursuing, right? I remember in college one time, man, we had this open door policy, and the expectation was like, hey, I have my door open, somebody's gonna come in here eventually, right? My RA had that open door policy for himself, but the one thing is, my freshman year, I never saw my RA. My door was always open, and I never saw the person who was supposed to lead me, right? That next year, I remember his name right now, Elijah Shirelli. We're name dropping in this joint, okay? Elijah Shirelli, he always came, right? If my door was closed, he knocked on my door just to see if I'm ready to roll. He would knock on my door and say like, "Hey, Isaac, I heard you had a bad game. Do you want to go and get some ice cream?" And just like, "Hey, man, I had a bad game. Don't want to go get ice cream." Right? Makes me feel a little bloated, and I feel a little bit bad about myself. But he would always engage and try to pursue like, "Hey, what does Isaac need today?" That's something I always encourage our RAs to do, and that's something I always encourage our new student mentors to do. It's just like, hey, we can say that people are welcome, but are you actually welcoming? Are you actually doing things that welcome people? Instead, let's work on pursuing people. Let's work on pursuing people and their needs. Increase your programmatic engagement, right? We want to make sure that we, again, update those learning outcomes. But when we talk about increasing that programmatic engagement, hey, you have programs on your docket that you have already budgeted for. You have programs on your docket that we consider traditions. All right, that's great. You have programs on your docket that you know that like, hey, only 150 people are going to show up to this program. You may be at a school in which 1,000 people are going to show up to your program. But sometimes it's worth it to make sure that we're pursuing the needs of our underrepresented students to have a program that you know only 15 students are going to show up to. You know 15 students are going to show up to those programs because like that program is tailored for a very specific population of students. Educating your current population. And so maybe you have a population that's majority white. And so you're gonna push out this event for international students, and you're gonna have a lot of students on your campus that are just like, why are we having this event? Like, why are we putting money towards this event? Aren't there other things that we can actually do? And that's a fair question because a lot of times people from our institution are just unaware. right? I have friends in my friend group I was the first Black person they ever saw in their life, right? And so taking the civic responsibility to teach your peers, here are why these things are important. Here's why you should be an advocate. Here's why you should come to this event so you can meet a diverse group of people. And again, improving academic representation. And so if you're an institution with just like, hey, a lot of our teachers kind of look the same, that's a question that you can ask for the people who work at your institution. Can we have a more diverse set of classes? Can we have a more diverse set of chapel speakers? Can we have a more diverse set of leaders at our institution? These are important questions that you guys can ask. Beverly Daniel Tatum has this great quote. We used one of our quotes earlier, that comes from While the Black Kids Sit at the Lunch Table. The relevant question, she says, is not whether all whites are racist, but how we can move more white people from a position of active or passive racism to one of active racism. What's super important about this quote is that she actually challenges us to take a peek at, like, hey, people aren't racist. She's not accusing people of being racist. And one of the funky things about conversations like this is we look at the landscape of discussions like this, and I get a lot of my students who say, like, I feel bad because I just feel like I just had a conversation with someone and they just made me feel bad about being white. That's not what we're saying. What we are saying is having a more active approach allows for everyone to engage in their needs, right? Again, Ohana means family, and family means no one get left behind. No one gets left behind means everyone has their needs taken care of and everyone gets to live in joy. One last point, the note of windows and mirrors. And so when we talk about, like, okay, like, you gave us some action steps, but what does that actually mean? Providing your students with windows and mirrors, right? Rudine Sims Bishop is a professor at Ohio State, and she comes up with this concept of mirrors and windows, right? Mirrors are resources that reflect one's own culture and helps one form their own identity. Windows are resources that reveals a worldview of other cultures. And so, yes, it's definitely important to kind of understand who you are and kind of things that you want to pursue in your own life. But what's also important is developing yourself from the standpoint of, I actually know what else is out there, right? Some people call it xenophobic, right? If you're a history major or sociology major, this is something that you hear a lot, is when countries are so afraid of adopting other understandings and broadening their horizons that these countries essentially fall. It's super, super important that we engage in diversity, and we engage in kind of what Ohana means from the standpoint of how can we actually work to develop ourselves and how can we actually work to develop our classmates in our programming. We'll have a discussion to discuss more about what this looks like at your institution. And so feel free to hop on the chat or kind of whatever that looks like, and then we'll see each other in a bit.